of mankind, widespread and exceptionally variant in its forms. It forms part of the set of presuppositions that underlie the most ancient shamanic rituals, carried over, perhaps. It is echoed in the foundational stories of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece. It manifests itself in allegorical forms, in the figure of the phoenix, for example, which immolates itself, regains its youthful form, and rises in triumph from the ashes. It recurs repeatedly in the tropes of popular culture as well, bringing even those entirely devoid of religious education under the spell. Marvel's iconic Iron Man plummets like Icarus from sky to ground after saving the world from demonic, serpentine, otherworld forces, and then arises from his death. The child wizard Harry Potter must ultimately die and be reborn to defeat Voldemort, a very thinly disguised Satan. All of that creative variation on a theme speaks of a deep, ineradicable, and eternally re-emergent psychological reality. We all see this in our day-to-day lives, and we all know it because we see it. A small failure, a small disappointment, frustration, or disenchantment engenders within us a small death, a small descent into the underworld, a small requirement for rebirth. A large failure produces a proportionately large catastrophe and transformation. When you are compelled to talk to someone because you face divorce or the failure of a treasured ambition or the illness or death of someone close, you are walking yourself through the eternal narrative. Stability, crisis, death, transformation, rebirth. That's the story of our lives. That's the fall and the reestablishment of paradise. The idea that the Savior is the figure who dies and resurrects is a representation in dramatic or narrative form of the brute fact that psychological progress, indeed learning itself, requires continual death and rebirth of lesser and greater magnitude. If you are engaged in a serious interpersonal conflict or argument, or facing a true crisis in your life, the new information confronting you cannot be incorporated without the oh-so-painful demise of your previous conceptions, and all of the resistance comprehension of that pain necessarily entails. That's part and parcel of the process so famously described as assimilation and accommodation by the great developmental psychologist Jean Piaget. We each confront the world with a set of preconceptualizations whose function is simultaneously to delimit and render pragmatic our very perceptions, thoughts, and actions. In the absence of this a priori, we simply cannot function. Nonetheless, it is still insufficient. No one ever knows enough, and what we each do not yet know will, at some moment of crisis, become of vital importance. When something new and Hydra-like confronts us and shakes us to our core, what is old and anachronistic within must therefore immolate itself and die. It is very rare indeed to learn something profound without suffering the terrible pain of dashed dreams and the soul-shaking terror of uncertainty and doubt. This means that none of us should identify in the most fundamental sense with what we currently know and presume. Means as well that we should all come to understand that, so that we do not remain confused about who we are. This means that it is never sufficient to be conservative or to identify with the past, or to become ideologically or dogmatically committed, or to remain stubbornly anachronistic and unchanged. The environment transforms headlong around us, and we all must run as fast as we can, as Ellis's Red Queen well knew, just to stay in the same place. It is not sufficient either to abandon tradition and structure entirely in a headlong and irresponsible rush towards the anomalous and revolutionary. Structure is insufficient, but it is still necessary, and the ethical requirement for respecting and maintaining it is still of paramount import. We each must as well similarly avoid falling prey to the temptation of identifying with the chaotic, depressing, anxiety-ridden, and nihilism-inducing state of affairs engendered by the terrible confrontation with the genuinely unknown. Even when thrust into the underworld by the dread events of our life, We must not characterize ourselves as permanent inhabitants of that dark and dread place, lest we lose hope, despair, and seek revenge. To progress psychologically, you must let go, sacrifice, time and again in the face of successive obstacles. You must abandon those things that, and often those people who, are impeding your progress, despite the fact that you may have held them very close to your heart. When you're wrong, when you've missed the mark, when you've sinned, because that is the meaning of sin, you must let the part of you that is wrong and aiming improperly die. Then you must allow the new spirit manifesting itself within to spring to life. That new spirit, that's the terrible information contained in whatever error you committed, in living conjunction with the now transformed structures you originally employed to frame the situation. That new spirit, it's a manifestation as well, and in other words, of the potential within you that had not yet been called forth by the previous travails of your life. Christ is symbolically the way and the truth of life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. Embracing the process of voluntary death and rebirth that is identical with psychological development means determining to move forward and upward despite the horrors of life. It means as well, symbolically speaking, rejuvenating the dead father or rescuing him from stagnation and deterioration in the eternal underworld. Forthright individual confrontation with the unknown renews the individual, but also catalyzes cultural revitalization. This is the essence of Christian ritual and belief, articulated as a psychological principle. We must identify with that part of ourselves that is always stretching beyond what we currently know and has the faith to let go of old certainties so that new patterns of being can be brought into place. It is through identification with the process symbolized by Easter that we are each redeemed and our culture revivified and salvaged. We are all the slaves of Pharisees and lawyers, of those who place dogma above spirit at the cost of spirit. We are all subject to betrayal by ourselves and by all those who surround us. We are all facing extinction in the most torturous of manners. But there is a spirit within us with sufficient courage to confront the true horrors of existence forthrightly, to allow the transformation, even death, that such confrontation catalyzes to occur and to leap forward renewed. How is it that life might prevail in the face of death and hell? With arms open, embracing its fate. We are all fallen creatures, and we all know it. We are all separated from what should be and thrown into the world of death and despair. We are all brutally crucified on the cross that is the reality of life itself. To rebel against that fate merely worsens it, transforming what could be mere tragedy into something indistinguishable from hell. To argue bitterly and despair around the deathbed of a loved one, to take a single example, is to turn all the pain of death and loss into something far worse. To accept instead? Is that simultaneously to transcend? It's certainly courage and truth and perhaps even love, and these three forces are something to behold. Are they more powerful than despair and the desire for vengeance? That is the Christian suggestion. And the Christian command? To act out the proposition that courage and truth and love are more powerful than death and despair, and to accept what transpires as a consequence. That is Easter and the death and resurrection of Christ. We forget or remain blind to such things at our great peril. Superiority doctrine. Maybe it's a combination of 3, or maybe it's some set of 4 out of 10. Who knows? And because of that, it doesn't seem as repugnant. And there was also a universalizing tendency among the communists that seemed to be less morally reprehensible than the ethno-nationalism of the Nazis. So, you think, if you go back to 1914, it's complicated, but if you go back to, say, 1918, at the time of the Russian Revolution, it's not like the communists knew that their attempts to bring about the socialist utopia would be doomed to absolute murderous catastrophe, right? They were working in ignorance. Now, it's not that simple, because by that time Dostoevsky had already written The Devils, the Possessed, and he outlined very, very clearly what he thought would happen if people like that got the reins of power. And Nietzsche had done the same thing in his writing. So people knew that there was something toxic, let's say, and deadly about the doctrine. But it hadn't been played out on the world stage. But now, it's like, well, this is why I said what I said at the beginning. Fine. You know, if I don't know exactly how to make the moral distinction, but it's a distinction that has to be made. I think that people who apologize, who say something, like I think that it's virtually, I don't know if it's as reprehensible to say that a given ethnic group should be consigned to the fire and to say that wasn't real communism, but they're damn close. And when I hear someone say that wasn't real communism, I know what they mean. What they mean was, if I was the dictator in Stalin's shoes, I personally would have brought in the utopia. That's what that statement means. Or it means an ignorance of history that's so utterly appalling that any political statement made on behalf of that person whatsoever should immediately be followed by a paroxysm of extreme embarrassment.
May I say one, I just want to be clear that these students were conceding that they don't agree. They share your critique of
they don't share it enough.
Oh, okay, fair enough. I just wanted to make that clear. So they would more or less agree with what you just said, I think, about it's not okay to say those regimes weren't proper communism and that proper communism should be tried. They still dispute, though, that socialism as an ideology is on par with Nazism. So I just wanted to make that clear.
We could say communism, let's say. We could say radical leftist ideology. As I said already, there are reasons for the left and the right wing, right? The right wing stands for hierarchy and the left wing stands for those who are displaced by hierarchy, right? An endless problem. But that doesn't mean, that still leaves it in the camp of the people speaking on behalf of egalitarianism to figure out just what the hell went wrong and to take some responsibility for it. You know, it's no joke. And we see these things play out continually. Still, look at what happened to Venezuela. Here's a fun story. Do you know that it is now illegal for physicians to list starvation as the cause of death for a Venezuelan child in a hospital? That's how they're dealing with the fact of starvation, right? You just make it illegal to have that diagnosed as your cause of death. That'll solve the problem. It's like, you know, we have a group of well-meaning socialists in Canada who just produced something called the LEAP Manifesto a couple of years ago, and it's a pretty radical document. They're trying to move our Socialist Party, the NDP, New Democratic Party, towards the acceptance of this LEAP Manifesto, which doesn't look like it's going to happen. But they were all radical promoters of the Venezuelan government before everything went like badly sideways. You know, I think the average Venezuelan now has lost 17 pounds. And that's not because they were put on a voluntary dieting program, right? It's not good. And so if you're tilting towards the left and you're temperamentally inclined that way, and half the population is, then you have an ethical problem on your hands, which is, how do you segregate yourself from the radical policies that produced the catastrophes of the 20th century? And you can't just say, well, that's not my problem. It's like, well, okay, if it's not your problem now, it certainly might become your problem in the future. So, and I would say it's actually everybody's problem. In the aftermath of the 20th century, it's everybody's problem. So it's complicated. Like, there is a genuine desire. Like, I worked for a socialist party for quite a while when I was a kid. You know, and I saw both sides of it. I saw some very, very admirable people. I was privy, for a variety of chance reasons, to the leadership of the Socialist Party in Canada at the provincial and the national level. I met the people who ran the provinces, some of the provinces, and who ran the party. And a lot of them were really admirable people. Like they'd spent their whole life, I would say, working on behalf of the working class, you know. So they were genuine labor leaders, and there was also a lot done in Canada on the left that looks like it was actually pretty good. Standard work week, the establishment of pensions, the introduction of our healthcare system, which I would say probably overall works better than the American system, although not at the upper end. And they were working hard on behalf of people who had working class lives. But then I also encountered the sort of low-level activist types, and I didn't have any respect for them at all. I just thought they were peevish and resentful and irritable. And those two things exist in a very uneasy coalition on the West. There's care for the poor and hatred for the successful. And those two things aren't the same at all. And it looks to me like one of the things that really happened when the communist doctrines were brought into play. And it also, by the way, we did the multinational experiment, right? It doesn't matter where you put these policies into play, the same bloody outcome occurred. Didn't matter whether it was Russia or China or Cambodia or Vietnam, or to pick a random African country, or Cuba or Venezuela for that matter. It was an unmitigated catastrophe. And so to me, that's experiment plus replication. Enough. Well, that has to be dealt with, and it's not. And the intellectual left in the West has been absolutely appalling in their silence on the communist catastrophe. Like for my students, a lot of my students really haven't heard about anything that happened in the Soviet Union in any detail until they take my personality class in the second year of university. It's like, well, what the hell? Why are they learning about that in a personality class in the second year of university? That should be first and foremost in their historical knowledge, what happened in the 20th century. I mean, it was almost fatal what happened, and we still haven't completely recovered from it, right? I think, isn't your president, Donald Trump, going to talk to, like, insane totalitarian number one sometime here in the near future? But that's still a Soviet-era state. Those people are armed to the teeth. You know, they have the weapon. They have weaponry that could easily take you out. And so we're not, I don't know if you know, do you know what happens if you blast a single hydrogen bomb 100 miles above the United States? Just one. You lose all your electronics. Right, they're all done. Tractors, cars, trains, subways, computers, phones, all of them burn out. And that's it. So we're not done with this yet. And the Korean state, North Korea, as an emblematic representative of the communist catastrophe, and everyone there starves. There's millions of people died 20 years ago. It's not got any better. So it's not like we solved this problem. And there's a deafening silence on the intellectual side of the spectrum with regards to what happened on the egalitarian left. And there's no excuse for it. So
somewhat relatedly, I think it's fair to say that even though you have criticized segments of both the left, social justice warriors, and the right, the alt-right, your critical commentary over the last year and a half has focused significantly more on the left than on the right. A lot of people I've talked to here at Lafayette take issue with that. They say that we're so far from a Marxist takeover of our culture and political institutions that to suggest otherwise is to engage in a classic kind of right-wing exaggeration and hysteria that we've seen before in Western countries in the early to mid-20th century. They also say, and this is important to them, that the nationalist authoritarian right poses more of a threat to freedom of the individual than the left does today, as it has in the West since the early 20th century. They argue that the left may have sway in the academy and large segments of the media, but nationalist right parties, figures, and movements